extended interview that, left-handed gay men are are ideally suited for this. And that seems absurd, but you have to understand that in terms of like a psychological hierarchy and lines of psychological development or archetypes along which you can develop yourself, um, there is a certain amount of developmental potential that will push you up to the next level, like one up the level, and that developmental potential is kind of cultivated through trauma, right? And so you would think that people who are able to do this would be people who have had some kind of trauma, or who maybe don't view the world in the same way other people do, and so they have a little bit more developmental potential than most people do, right? And that developmental potential has to push you to a place that would be beyond what most humans would consider socially acceptable. And so if you're able to do that and take this stuff to a place that would be kind of considered almost socially unacceptable, you have to understand that to be like a left-handed gay man, you're already doing that, right? That kind of psychological development is like old hat to you. So because you've been doing it your whole life, right? So that is why these people have that ability, and it's so when he says that, people think it's ridiculous because he doesn't frame it. He hasn't framed it in this whole psychological development kind of language. Instead, people I've seen people online posting, "Oh, well, that sounds half-hearted," But 'cause they think that this is an artifact of biology, but it's not. It's a psychological artifact. What he's kind of hinting at there, but he never really says that, you know. But
Tom X, he does say the trauma piece is key.
yeah, and it's the trauma and being able to work through that trauma to get to a place where you could develop yourself beyond most humans psychologically. That propels you there. So, I mean, that stuff makes sense to me, actually, in that context.
Yeah. Chris, you have a question?
Yeah. So first of all, I appreciate what I hear is kind of a general guidance to kind of lean into trauma as opposed to trying to avoid it. And in my own psychological reading, I see the wisdom of things like wounded healer archetypes, where those who have suffered are those who are capable of healing. But where I was kind of wondering about is I'm looking at what has happened in, let's say, the past 4 to 6 months in the UAP community. And it very much feels like we've gone from a state where you had things like the UAP NDAA amendment, where it felt like there was sort of a grassroots effort that people could constructively contribute to. And while we weren't doing it perfectly and there was the usual online bickering, there was a kind of a collectivist movement, and it was kind of clear how people could make a difference. And I'm trying to figure out how this has happened. It almost feels like a little bit of a kind of a sleight of hand or bait and switch, where it feels like the ball has been taken out of the collective's hands and put into a group of a very few individuals. And we're kind of being given pieces to engage with through things like the News Nation interviews. And I'm looking at how the community is responding, and it feels very much like the dialogue is devolving. There's a lot of kind of fighting over, is Jake Barber real, not, going into these kind of tribalistic spaces that so much discourse on the internet goes into. And I do wonder if some of that is coming from sort of a sense of impotence, of either not being able to find a way to grab onto this and do something constructive with it within this community, or larger issues of the world. So as an individual, as someone who is, many of us are, not directly connected to any of the key players, do you have any advice for us on how to navigate this moment? I'm hearing that inner work. What does that actually look like in a concrete manner?
Yeah, well, I mean, that inner work, it can be very tedious. It's something that requires your daily attention and sometimes constant attention throughout the day. But the thing that I preach is just that people need to go within, right? And you hear people say that all the time, and this is the part that's difficult to articulate. So everybody has like this kind of voice that'll say, "Oh, don't do that," you know, but you'll do it anyway, right? and so
No comment on that.
right, but that is intuition, right? And so the more you follow that, the better off you'll be, and the more you will develop yourself. And you shouldn't be afraid to lean into that. But and if people want something to do, right? There's a wonderful series of books. I talk about it in my book, called King, Lover, Warrior, Magician. And these are like the four main ones. And what you have to do is develop yourself along those archetypal lines. Archetypes are just lines of psychological development. That's all they are, right? And so in that you become the perfect king, the perfect lover, the perfect warrior, and the perfect magician. Magician's just a seeker of knowledge, right? And so, you develop yourself along these lines, and you just keep going up, it is so hard to explain, but you have to understand that the universe is it's like a created thing, right? And so creation is one of the main tenets of the universe. And if you're wondering, if you're developing yourself in a positive direction or a negative direction, all you have to do is use this simple litmus test, right? Where you say, okay, is what I'm doing generative? Is it creative? Right? Does it build something? And if it does that, then you're on the right track. But if it's destructive in any way, right? If it's negative, then you're not headed in the right direction with it.
And I think
so
you have to.
Yeah, and I would read those books because he does kind of a wonderful job of laying out what those archetypes look like when they're manifest in someone who is manifesting those archetypes in their wholeness, right? And so you just have to make yourself resemble that, but you have to really mean it, right? And that's the key, is that you're not, if you say something or if you behave a certain way and you don't actually believe that, then you're not fooling anybody, right? You're not going to fool the universe. The universe created you. It knows, right? You're not going to pull the wool over its eyes.
I appreciate that. And you're trying to also explain something which is coming from an intuitive, internal, emotional sense using this, which doesn't always do the best job of that. So
right, yeah.
Thank you for that. I wondered though, speaking of archetypes, and I don't want to get too political, but it seems to me that the world is serving us up right now in some individual humans prime examples of a very destructive, non-creative archetype. Is there any cosmic significance to that, or what are we to make of that? Because it just feels so almost so exaggerated or polarized.
Yeah. Well, you have to understand that as you're doing this work, so you have this spark within you that is the immortal part of yourself, right? And you can think and in psychology, you just refer to that as the subconscious, right? The collective subconscious. And the whole goal is to touch the subconscious so that you know, right? For yourself, you just know. And so as you're getting closer to this, the subconscious is a very destructive force. It seeks to destroy that which does not resemble itself, right? These archetypes are fully developed in the subconscious, right? And so as it's punching its way to the surface in your mind, if you are someone who projects those archetypes on the world out there, right? And you have this battle going on within you where the subconscious is punching its way out, and you're projecting that on the world, you know, you're gonna set out to destroy the world, if that makes any sense, because you're seeking to destroy anything that doesn't resemble yourself. And that's where, you know, in terms of is it generative or not, if you find that you hate minorities or you hate migrants or whatever the case may be, it's because you're projecting this inner battle, right? Rather than dealing with it internally, you are projecting it. And so you hate those people over there, or you hate this object, or you hate this house, or whatever, you know, whatever the case may be. And it's a psychological artifact of your projection, this inner battle.
Talk about the collective consciousness, like, or subconscious. Like, I mean, we are collectively perhaps manifesting this force and energy right now, and that's what we're seeing potentially personified. I mean, and that's scary, but there's hope in it, right? Because if we're manifesting it, then that means there's some kind of conflict happening, which can be a gateway. It may be a violent opening when it finally gives way, but there is a possibility for growth there. Am I wrong?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I hate to frame it this way, but this is something I always tell people about. You know, like World War II, right? You cannot tell me that at the end of World War II, right, when you've got former Nazis that are now having to pick up the rubble that is Germany, that in the aftermath of that, you can't tell me that there wasn't one person that was like, this wasn't worth it. You know what I mean? And I mean, they know. I would be willing to bet the majority of people were like, none of this was worth it, right? Because Germany was, they were rationing until the 1980s after the war. They were so completely destroyed that they were rationing until the 80s. So yeah, I mean, that right there, prime example of how in the rubble, the phoenix rising from the ashes, as it were, you know, you become better in having destroyed yourself. If that makes any sense at all.
Process is gonna suck. I mean, basically,
Yeah.
like that's one of the things that you've been talking about recently, also online, was the IFNJ, like personality types.
INFJ, yeah.
Yeah, and the enneagrams, right? Is that the right word?
It's
Enneagram?
the Myers-Briggs. It's like the Myers-Briggs personality scale, right? And Jung helped develop that. And one of the reason why I was talking about that is because a lot of experiencers that I've run into are INFJ personality types, or something close to it, right? But usually always introverted. And when you're introverted, what that means is that you are good at embodying and becoming those psychological lines of development that are archetypes, right? And so you embody those things rather than projecting them out. And, you know, that's what's responsible for all of this Republicans versus Democrats, because I think Democrats are better at embodying those things, and Republicans tend to be people who would project those on the world, right? And it's important to teach people how to do that, and we haven't been doing that. And so there's no like spiritual war going on here. It's not. Spiritual warfare happens inside, right?
Yeah.
And if you're projecting it on the world as spiritual warfare, or as political warfare, then you're just projecting. That's all you're doing. You're not embodying those things.
Go ahead, Chris.
Is there ever a role for so hearing the INFJ type and its possibilities for spiritual growth? is there an ideal role for the other Myers-Briggs types that is helpful and generative?
Uh, you know, I don't know. I think all of the other personality types are just what you are on the path to becoming INFJ, right? Because INFJ it's the rarest personality type in the world. It's something like maybe 1% of the world population. So, and I've noticed that if you have a bunch of experiencers in a room, you'll have like 10 people in the room, and you'll have like 7 INFJ types, and being as rare as it is, you would it's grossly overrepresented in the experiencer population. So yeah.
Maybe they're used to going in. Interestingly, all this process requires us to be brutally self-honest, though, too, right? Like, we need to assess our ability to embody archetypes accurately,
Right.
and that's hard, especially if we don't have any kind of education into what that looks like. So that requires, people to be motivated to do the research and all of those sorts of things. How can we collectively, as a society, make that a more operative part of like personal development? What can we do absent, requiring people to sort of engage? Is there anything we can do?
This stuff, I don't care what people say. Eventually, this stuff is going to be taught in school. Starting in kindergarten, you're going to start to learn this stuff. Because it's the only wise thing to do if you want to have a stable kind of forever civilization. You can't the more technologically advanced you become, the less tolerance there can be for people who are extroverts, right? Who are projecting all this stuff. Because, some extrovert having a bad day, they can push a button and end it for everyone, and so that needs to be an idea that would just be unthinkable, and the only way you can keep that is to teach people this stuff. And I think you could probably, I don't know, you could write kids books along these lines, simple kid stories about projecting and introverting and things like that, and kids will get it. They'll get it. They'll understand it.
A lot of our current, media and information environment is like the opposite of that through like social media and whatnot. And I tend to think that there's going to be a looming, we're going to have to deal with that culturally if we're ever going to start to advance again as a society or get through some of these bumps that we're currently going through. But one follow-up question to all of this notion that in order to engage with the transcendent, we need to develop ourselves. There are people who are not developed, who seem to have great ability, like famously Ted Owens, the PK Man or whatever, that Jeffrey Mishlove wrote his book, and this guy was all over the map, like kind of a little bit psycho, really vain, trying to get a lot of attention for himself. And so he doesn't seem like a very well-developed personality, but yet he seemed to have this connection with things. How do you explain that sort of connection in this framework?
I have a bit of a hypothesis with stuff like that. I don't know if this is true, but just based on my knowledge, I'm thinking that it may be something like this, in that you can start to have these connections without actually having ever touched the subconscious, right? And you can have anomalous experiences without ever having touched the subconscious. But it's just, as you're getting closer to it, the more you will experience. And so I think that you can be very extroverted and maybe you see a ghost, or something like that in your house. And so I think these things are definitely possible. I mean, I had engagement with the phenomenon and personal experiences that pushed me in a direction to cultivate these archetypes beyond the point where most humans would go, because we just don't see a reason to develop ourselves that fully, you know. But having been there, I can see every reason to do that. So I think that everybody can have these to some extent, you know, but it's just the more you develop yourself and the more you follow that kind of stuff. Like, so if you see a ghost one day, don't now shy away from these types of experiences. You know, you need to tell yourself, oh, I want more, you know, show me more. And that takes a certain amount of bravery, which I think a lot of people don't have. And I think that furthermore, you know, there are people, they claim that, you know, they summon these things or whatever, and I feel like a lot of that is just, I wonder how much of that is because the phenomenon is trying to get you to develop yourself, and so it allows these things, but that once you reach a certain level, you don't need that anymore, right? Like, I feel like maybe I could, I don't know, maybe I could meditate and sit out in my front yard and summon some orbs, or get an egg to come down in the road. But why? You know, why would I do that? And it goes back to this question of, you know, sure, maybe you can do that, but should you be doing that for people who are just extroverts that are going to come and take that stuff and build weapons out of it? Why do I want to develop your technology to exert power and control over everyone else when all you're really seeking is the power and control over your own mind? But since you can't control your own mind, you set out to control everyone around you, you know? And it's just doesn't sit right with me at all. But I think that the phenomenon, and that's why I wonder how much of that is the phenomenon trying to get you to develop yourself, and so it allows this. And so people think that they have these abilities when they kind of maybe really don't. You know, maybe it's like, I don't know, the way you would play with a child, right? Oh, you know, little Johnny, look at you with your little dump truck. You're a construction worker. Or a little girl putting on a sequin outfit and pretending to be a princess, you know, and the parents are like, oh, you're such a princess, you know, and really you're not. So, you know, but it's just a way to get them going, and maybe not necessarily, maybe it's having consequences that they don't intend. You know what I mean? In other words, like, other humans look at these people and they say, oh, you know, they can summon these things at will. They must be some kind of wizard.
The superpowers.
Yeah, or they're the best among us, and maybe they're not. You know, your cake, that story in Point. You know, the guy he had all these weird quirks about it, but he wasn't psychologically stable, though, was he?
No, he wasn't.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny you say that, speaking of this and how experiencers can be taken advantage of, and I also see similarities, I would say, with some of these spiritual movements, where you often have people that wouldn't maybe necessarily label themselves as experiencers, but as people seeking spiritual development, and they will find a guru, and then inevitably it winds up in this kind of abusive cult-like relationship. And there's a challenge there, and I wonder, like, I wouldn't identify myself as an experiencer, but I often reflect on, you know, how do I be an ally to them, or what should that community itself be doing? Because there is kind of a vibe within all of ufology that we want the masses to take this seriously, or to legitimize experiencer things, and yet there is the risk of, you know, advantage being taken of that. And I'm also, it feels a little bit at odds with inner work, and, you know, because you're inherently looking for some kind of external validation with that. So do you have any advice for the experiencer community on the whole in this kind of era? Like, if you're an experiencer, what should you be doing? Should you be advocating on behalf of the community, and how do you do that in a healthy way?
Yeah, I would say that there is a lot that can be done, but I you know, there's so much to be done. In fact, that it's almost like a titanic struggle. When I start to think about it, it feels like I was telling somebody the other day that it's like, oh, it's such an uphill battle, and then I was like, scratch that. It's not uphill. I'm like up against a cliff face, is what I'm up against. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that what people can do is what they're kind of doing, right? They start groups, but I think that we have to get away from the idea that these things are going to be paid, right? That you have to be paid for something if you're going to be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
If it's worth doing, it's worth doing, and it doesn't matter if you're getting paid for it. I talk to people all the time. I never ask anybody for a dime. You know what I mean? And that's how you can kind of weed out grifters, right? Because I do that kind of thing because I realize what I came into, and I realize that this is for everyone, right? I don't own this. If somebody else wants to talk about archetypes, yeah, let's all talk about archetypes. The more the merrier, the more the better. Like so yeah, let's get away from the idea of charging people for things. And yeah,
Brilliant.
that's always like my go-to thing with if somebody's asking you for money and they've got their hand out, I just wouldn't take it seriously.
I have a couple of
Um,
theological follow-ups to some of the things that you've been talking about. First off, you mentioned like NHI's role in this and what it's doing by allowing certain people access or people seeming to have an ability. Do you view, the other, this whatever it is we're encountering, as a unitary thing, or is it a bunch of smaller beings, or is it sort of both? I mean, a lot of people talk about like a sort of a hidden ecosphere of different things, and sometimes we may be contacting this, or there may be something that's more malevolent that we might be contacting, and we have to kind of be discerning in how we engage. What are your thoughts on that?
my thoughts on that is that it is all the same thing. I think that and this is one of the conclusions that I came to early on when I was going through this, and it was just a logic and reason thing for me where I saw, yeah, there are people who say they're bad, there's people who say they're good, and I thought, well, what is the truth there? And then I started thinking about all this tech they have, right? And I thought, well, imagine if humans had that tech. What would we do with it? We would kill ourselves with it. That's what we would do. And so I thought to myself, well, obviously you've got to be psychologically much more developed in order to be able to handle that and handle it on a societal level and not be destroyed by it. So they have to be much more mature than we are. And so the story that people tell about malevolent beings and they come down to just mess with you, it's like, well, I didn't buy that because I was like, well, I wouldn't do that now at my level of psychology because it's just not fun. So why would something so advanced get their kicks from that? It doesn't make any sense. And so I thought, well, there's got to be something else going on here. And then when I came into the higher consciousness thing, it was like, oh, okay, I kind of get this now. And so when you come up against experiencers and they have these, oh, it's good or it's bad, kind of narratives about it. I think what you're seeing there is not necessarily that, because all of these kind of stories have they all have things in common, right? They all seem to have common threads throughout them. But the way that the person is interpreting them is different, right? And so what you're seeing there is not necessarily different stories from different things. What you're seeing is a differing level of developmental potential within the experiencer themselves, right? So you're not talking about different experiences with different things. It's just different people with different levels of developmental potential. if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about the phenomenon often working as as a mirror, kind of a reflective
Yeah.
function, and if that's the case, depending on what's residing inside your own psyche, that might be what's being reflected in the experience that you're having.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I can speak directly to that. I mean, I was terrified. I was like a 39-year-old man, and in the military, and I'm sleeping with the lights on because the dark scared the bejesus out of me, you know? And that is ridiculous, but uh it happened, and when decided that, I can't keep going like this. This is killing me. I'm not sleeping. I'm not functional throughout the day. I'm up all night because I just can't stomach going to sleep. So I thought, well, I'm just gonna have to decide that this isn't gonna bother me anymore. I'm just gonna let it be what it is, you know? Because I mean, I've done that throughout my life with other things. Why not with this? Didn't make any difference. So that's what I did, and everything changed after that.
And then one other follow up about some of the stuff you were talking about with you're saying it's sort of a common idea, or at least an idea that's repeated itself throughout history, that we have a filament of God, a spark of God within, right? And I tend to believe it. That's my base level intuition about things, or what I've read. But what's your conception? Is that what you would call sort of the soul, or the higher self? And I'm interested just in to sort of get at, like, what's your view of, like, say, reincarnation, or those sorts
Yeah.
of things? Do you see that as part and parcel of all of this, or are we living one shot? Do your best. Good
Oh
luck.
no. No, not at all. I think that we get multiple shots. I mean, I think that we are eternal, right? I think we've always been around. It's just that we aren't as developed as others are, maybe. But yeah, I mean, the University of Virginia has all kinds of research on this. And one of the things that I found really fascinating about that research is they have like these 12, I think it's 1,200 cases that are like their best evidence for reincarnation. And one of those that I saw, on, I don't know if it was a podcast or a TV show or something, but there was this little boy who was black in the life that he had remembered, but in this life today, he's a little white boy, and it's like, wow, all of these people that are, out there talking about migrants and
Yeah.
everything else. It's like, you better watch it. You're coming, you're coming right back here, and you might be one of those migrants next time, you
Chris
know?
made exactly that point in a conversation we had earlier this week, that if reincarnation's true, it just throws out so many of our knee-jerk biases about things. It's like,
Yeah.
even if you're not the downtrodden one now, chances are you will be, or you have been. So maybe let's rethink, the humanity of some of these people that we loathe.
Well, and
Uh,
frankly, if I was, I said this in the context of to James that, if there was one piece in this whole UAP, woo, whatever you want to call meta field that I would love to have unarguable proof for, that would be it. Because of that, more than anything else, would I think change how people lived.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
profound.
absolutely. And I,
Ian
and
Stevenson and Jim Tucker are the researchers, I think, at University of
yeah,
Virginia. And they have
yeah.
some books if people are interested in looking, because it seems really compelling, the evidence they have.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. I mean that little boy was able to pick out like the playground his mother would take him to, in pictures. He was able to pick out the correct playground. And how would that be? You know?
Yeah.
It's
Or
just
there's like many examples of where people would what they noticed a lot of times is that the people who remembered their past lives were people who had died suddenly or violently in their
Mhm.
previous life, like they were ripped out of whatever existence they'd had prior. And oftentimes they would find that they'd have a birthmark that would directly correspond to the fatal injury that killed off their previous personality. And I mean, and they wouldn't know that until they identified the person that this person, claimed to be, I mean, it's just like the odds of that being some kind of weird coincidence or manipulation are very, very low. It's just too much information
Yeah.
stacks up.
Yeah, and I mean, why would someone want to lie about that? Because you're just kind of inviting criticism,
Yeah,
and it's not like you're getting anything for that.
yeah. And a lot of
Um,
these are kids who don't even know
yeah.
that it's a, you know, yeah. Anyway, I find that whole subject very fascinating.
Yeah, and so what you were saying before though about and this is something that I don't really understand about it either myself. Is that you've got like the universal subconscious, but then there's also a part of you that can touch that is not quite that. You know what I mean? But it also is forever. So I don't know exactly how that works, but I think it has to. That has to be something like
One of the things, the ways that I heard you frame sort of parts of this on X briefly was that part of what we need to do in our self-development is get to where we're accurately reflecting our subconscious, which I guess is sort of like saying in becoming more like what we would call our higher self, like embodying that sort of advanced being that we all kind of carry around. Is that sort of a correct interpretation, do you think? And I wonder about, like, because I always tend to see it as like kind of a nested realities. Like there's each individual human on their journey, but then there's also humanity in general that's on its own psychological journey, and it's going through the same processes that we are. So how do we build whatever that collective unconscious idea of the good human is, or how can we access what that might look like for all of us? Is that possible?
You know, I don't know how we would do that. I mean, I think education is the key with anything like that. But I think you have to explain it to people. You have to meet them where they are, right? And so you have to really explain it to people in a way that they can actually begin to see it. Because once you can see it, you can't unsee it. And I had talked on X about how I had some success with that, where I would, with family members, right? How I would just sit down with them and we have like this kind of Socratic conversation in the evenings, me and my family members, and they'll ask me questions and I'll answer their questions. And we talk about this kind of psychological development stuff. And so, you know, now it's gotten to the point that, you know, they'll see something on TV and they'll be like, oh, that's whatever principle you're talking about, and they're able to correctly identify it, right? And so I know that people can do this, and I know that they can see it, because I've had some success in my understanding of that, right? So here's a funny story. I found a tortoise in my backyard, right? It was somebody in the neighborhood who caught a tortoise. So I was like, well, I can't let it go. So I got this huge tank for this little baby tortoise. Purchasing it, I got to put it outside now. But you know, whenever my brother explains this stuff, he's like, "Oh, that's just the tortoise tank, right?" Because what he's saying there is it's like the extroverted fake perception of everything, right? It's not the reality.
Yeah.
Right. But for the tortoise, this is its habitat, right? This is what it thinks the world is. It's this tortoise thing. And it's not. So he always equates everything with the tortoise thing. I'm like, oh, it's just the tortoise thing.
Kind of like Donald Hoffman's operating system or whatever, right? Like, where what we perceive is only what our brain allows us to perceive, so we can survive and thrive and evolve. But there may be all kind of stuff going on over there.
It's the tortoise moved out.
Yeah, there you
Right.
go. Totally.
Yeah.
See, it's all comes full circle.
Yeah.
Chris, did you have any questions you wanted to ask?
Just kind of maybe including one for me.
Sure.
And tying on to kind of James's idea of a collective evolution. Trust your discernment, and you've got a really sharp discernment, Matthew. So I'm curious as to your take on this. We have some friends that are kind of follow, speaking voices in the astrological and spiritual communities, and I'm seeing common threads around 2025, 26 being a year of massive, both personal and collective transformation. And I've not studied those fields well enough to have my own good sense of that, but I wonder what your take would be on that. It certainly feels like there's a lot of energy that could be harnessed out there right now. Curious your take.
Well, I think the energy that can be harnessed is kind of this right, and that's the energy that can be harnessed. I don't ascribe to the idea that anything is going to happen in any particular year. I know I've heard like 2027 farming figure out, but I don't know how big of fans you guys are of, like, so Bledsoe had put out that the lady that when a certain star aligns with the Sphinx, the head of the Sphinx or something, that would be the time when humanity comes into this new consciousness. But the thing about that star is that it's in a constellation and so you could literally set your watch to that, right? Like that star aligns with that same spot of the Sphinx every year, right? But he doesn't know that. And so some friend of his at NASA told him, oh, that's going to happen in 2027 or something, and so he just kind of ran with that. But I mean, that's why you got to do your research, right? You can't just take this stuff at face value. You have to understand what these things are talking about. Because the phenomenon will do it too. People say, oh, the phenomenon lies, right? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. It's just that your discernment and your level of knowledge making it speaks with symbols. And you got to figure out what is it talking about, right? And so that's what it's talking about. This happens every year, right?
Well, it's like that whole trickster archetype, right? Like if it speaks in riddles or in symbols and you don't come out with the right interpretation, then it seems like it's trying to trick you. But maybe not necessarily the case. You just have to get better at reading the tea leaves, which I think is
Yeah, and a little cliffhanger. I'll leave you with this, right?
Okay.
If you want to read the best, I think it's the best myth about the trickster. The Homeric hymn to the god Earth. Read it. It's wonderful.
But also the magician. What's the one more time? Magician, lover, king.
King, lover, magician, warrior, and by Dr. Robert Elmore. Wonderful set of books. They're worth their weight in gold. Trust me.
If I get through those, would you be interested in coming back on at some point and having a discussion about them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of those books are kind of difficult to find. They're out of print.
Wow.
And there was one of those books I paid like $250 for. So I might have to, maybe if I can maybe loan you my copies, but I've got notes in the margins and everything. So I don't know if you'd be interested in reading that.
I'll see what I can find and see if I can get a hold of it. Maybe there'll be a PDF somewhere too. Sometimes those rare books have something. But
sounds like Neon Galactic needs to open up its own print offering and do a
I'm
small
telling you,
run
man.
press.
Yeah, I've got so many PDFs that I've scraped up from archive.org and every other place.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you what, Matthew, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation and really timely. I think it's important that people consider these things. And again, that notion that we can have all of the benefits without any of the inner work seems potentially really, really dangerous. And
It is
so,
very.
yeah. So maybe we need to slow down and figure out what we need to do with ourselves before we plunge headlong into whatever this may bring.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you, James. And thank you, Chris.